My friends, thank you for being here with us this morning. I am Kori Schake. I lead the Foreign and Defense Policy team here at the American Enterprise Institute, an organization committed to defending human dignity, expanding economic opportunity, and making the world a freer and safer place. And it is our joy today to welcome back to AEI one of the sternest and most demanding advocates of freedom, Poland's Foreign Minister, Radosław Sikorski. In addition to that pinnacle of his professional career that was being a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, he has also been a member of the European Parliament, a prominent journalist, defense minister of Poland, foreign minister of Poland. And he's going to talk to us this morning in conversation with Dalibor Rohac. Dr. Rohac is the point man for all things European here at the American Enterprise Institute. He holds a PhD in political economy from King's College, also did time at St. Antony's, Oxford, and is the author of In Defense of Globalization. Over to you, Dalibor.
Kori, thank you, and good morning, everybody. Welcome again to AEI, and warm welcome to everybody who's watching the live stream. I am indeed a fellow at AEI. I'm also a co-host of the Eastern Front podcast, where we discuss challenges to Europe's peace and security that have emerged along the line running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Absolutely delighted to moderate this conversation, which will reflect on the summit that has just wrapped up last night about its significance for the security of Eastern Europe. If I may make a plug for my own work, we recently published a little report on the alliance and its 75th anniversary with my colleagues Giselle Donnelly and Julia Joja, in which we make the case for a major stepping up in terms of the alliance's ambitions, including a clear path to Ukraine's membership and including a stronger deterrent posture along the eastern flank, as well as a deliberate rollback strategy against Russian influence and exploiting Russian weaknesses. So there's nobody better, arguably, to discuss these topics with than Radosław Sikorski, current and three-time Foreign Minister of Poland, on top of many other roles, a former resident scholar here at AEI. So we'll be in for a reenactment of one of Rembrandt's greatest works, the Return of Prodigal Son, which is a painting, unfortunately, which is still hanging in the Hermitage Gallery in St. Petersburg. So if I may make a proposal for the peace talks, I think that painting should be handed over to the Museum of Eastern and Western Art in Odessa, but more on that some other time. Now, before we kick off, I should say that there'll be a Q&A after the minister's speech and after the brief conversation we'll have. Just because of the crowd size, I would invite you to submit your questions online by emailing my colleague Catherine at .camberg@aei.org, or you can use the platform formerly known as Twitter with the hashtag NATO75WithAEI. Minister Radek, it's an utter joy to welcome you back. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kori. Thank you, Dalibor, for the invitation and for the warm welcome and introduction. It does feel like coming home after 20 years, even though I actually worked in the previous HQ. But since you mention it, I did go from AEI directly to the Polish Defense Ministry at the time, but my wife, Anne Applebaum, stayed behind with the kids. And she would routinely be asked, what does your husband do? And she said, well, he's the Polish defense minister. And there would always be two reactions to that. Number one, is that a job you can do from Washington? And number two, is it dangerous? Ladies and gentlemen, in 2005, when I was wrapping up my tenure at AEI, we lived in a different world. Back then, we were unaware of how much time one can waste staring at one's phone, arguing with strangers, or watching holiday pictures of people we hardly know. The premiere of the first iPhone was still 2 years away. Facebook was not yet available to a wider public, and YouTube launched only in February that year. Out in the world, the Chinese economy was at full speed, reaching a record level of 9.9% growth. But on the diplomatic and military front, authorities in Beijing still kept a low profile, mindful of Deng Xiaoping's famous maxim, hide your strength, bide your time. China has no intention to restrict or limit United States influence. The Chinese Assistant Foreign Minister Guan Fengsheng said in a CNN interview at that time, it had neither the will nor the capability. Chinese military spending amounted to 1/8 of what the US spent at the time. 20 years later, it is 4 times lower and stands at $229 billion. But according to an analysis published by AEI in April, Beijing's official data on its military expenses is misleading. The real number, supposedly, is closer to $700 billion, just $150 billion short of Pentagon's budget. Back in 2005, such rapid expansions seemed not only unbelievable, but unnecessary. As a newly admitted member of the World Trade Organization, China had much more to gain from participating in the international order than from challenging it. At least that is what we believed at the time in this town. So similar hopes held for Russia. Putin's handling of political opposition and independent media drew scrutiny from international observers, but no serious consequences followed. In November 2005, Angela Merkel assumed office as Germany's first female chancellor. She replaced Gerhard Schröder, Putin's bon ami, who would soon end up on Gazprom's payroll. Nord Stream started operating 6 years later. Few in the West sounded the alarm, but there were exceptions. The late Senator John McCain, already in 2003, warned that, quote, a creeping coup against the forces of democracy and market capitalism in Russia is threatening the foundations of the US-Russia relationship and raising the specter of a new era of cold peace between Washington and Moscow, end quote. It presents, John McCain argued, a fundamental challenge to American interests across Eurasia. The good senator was right, as usual. Already in 2005, Putin said that the collapse of the Soviet Empire was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, and he was determined to undo this calamity. As the numbers of democratic oppositionists shrank, Russian military budget began to swell. In 2005, it amounted to $27 billion in current dollars, or 3.3% of Russia's GDP. This year, it is set to reach $140 billion, 7.1% of Russia's GDP, and about 1/3 of the country's entire budget. The Kremlin advanced its agenda by a variety of means, by suppressing civil society, killing opposition leaders, meddling in electoral processes abroad, and finally, by invading insubordinate neighbors, starting with Georgia in 2008 and then moving on to Ukraine in 2014. And yet, the Russian gas and coal kept on flowing west, right until Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Even today, there is no shortage of political influencers blinded by global authoritarian propaganda and the myths that it peddles. So let me tackle some of these illusions one by one. Myth number one: Russia is one of the last and most committed defenders of Judeo-Christian values. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Russian Orthodox Church is a moral black hole. It incites hatred and greed. It condones targeted killings, rapes, and pillage. It lacks basic tolerance and respect for human dignity. It's a corrupt department of a corrupt state. Russian society seems to have fallen into a state of anomy, a total breakdown of moral values, standards, or guidance for individuals to follow. According to Russia's own interior ministry, the number of violent crimes committed in 2024 has reached 152,000, the highest figure in 15 years. This data correlates with a rapid increase in alcoholism from a very high base. Life expectancy for men in this supposedly conservative paradise is 65 years. To think that there are still people in the West who consider Putin a KGB colonel, a defender of Christianity, would be perversely amusing if it was not so hopelessly stupid. Myth number 2, Russia is invincible. That Russia, because they defeated Napoleon and Hitler, Russia always wins in the end, is the myth. Well, they lost their share of wars. The Crimean War in 1856, the war with Japan in 1905, World War I, the Bolshevik invasion against Poland in 1920, stopped at the gates of Warsaw, the Winter War with Finland of 1940, in which Finland lost territory but saved its independence, the war in Afghanistan, where the Soviet army was humiliated by the Mujahideen, equipped with American weapons. And finally, of course, the Cold War. Each of these losses shook up the Russian political system, forcing the authorities to introduce reforms. Russia only ever reforms itself after a lost war. The Kremlin can be stopped and even beaten. We just forgot about it. Myth number 3, the US must make a choice, either to deter Russia or to focus on China. My friend and mentor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, once said that Russia has a clear choice. It can either be an ally of the West, but there are some standards to follow, or a vassal of China. Driven by his personal ambitions rather than by a long-term interest of his country, Putin has chosen the latter. Taking advantage of Kremlin's predicament may be beneficial to Xi Jinping, but it has costs. For example, the image of China among Western societies has tumbled. From Australia through Japan, South Korea, Europe, all the way to North America, majorities now see Beijing more as a threat than a partner. That might change if Russia used its influence over Moscow to bring the aggressor to reason. For the time being, this seems unlikely, as both countries are bent more on blowing the world order up rather than restoring it. Other autocracies, with Iran and North Korea leading the pack, could not be more eager to help. This brings us to myth number 4. Authoritarian countries do not meaningfully cooperate, as there is no autocratic equivalent of NATO or the EU, and their ideologies are at odds with one another. But the emerging autocratic coalition does not need an alliance to be effective. Hal Brands, senior fellow here at AI, put it well in his recent Foreign Affairs article, quote, "Beijing and Moscow don't need to fight shoulder to shoulder, as Washington does with its allies, if they fight back to back against the liberal world. Instead of looking for formal alliances and networks, we should simply look at the facts. Russia displaced Saudi Arabia as the main exporter of crude oil to China. Beijing is also an indispensable client for Russian gas. The relationship, although unequal, is mutual. The value of Chinese exports to Russia between 2021 and 2023 increased by 63%. Among the exported items, dual-use goods, which feed Russia's military machine. The Islamic Republic of Iran has so far provided the Kremlin with thousands of drones. North Korea has sent millions of rounds of ammunition. Putin's recent visit to Pyongyang, first in almost a quarter of a century, concluded with an agreement pledging mutual aid if either country faces aggression. Kremlin's reliance on rogue states is growing heavier. A simple conclusion follows. To stifle the efforts of its adversaries, the community of democracies cannot deal with each threat in isolation. Seen from this perspective, Russian aggression in Ukraine is directly linked with a possible expansion of Chinese military and economic clout or Iranian-provoked disruption across the Middle East. Success of one member of the Axis will benefit others, either by engaging Western resources or by undermining its credibility. A tunnel vision, which makes us look at these challenges separately, should be replaced by a comprehensive outlook, which allows us to see them for what they really are, elements contributing to the inflection point at which we find ourselves. Myth number 5. As the post-war order finds itself under siege, the US should abandon international organizations and shift to bilateral relations or isolationism. Here I can only say that turning a blind eye does not make a problem disappear. And into the void left by the US, other countries, including China, always step in. And finally, myth number 6, Europe is not living up to current challenges and is therefore of little value as an ally. I'd like you to remember that so far, Ukraine's partners have allocated and committed almost $300 billion in economic and military assistance. This is according to the latest figures compiled by the German Kiel Institute for the World Economy. European contributions to this are 60% of the figure. On this, we are not free riders. The American package has actually only come up to about the same as the European contribution. In transatlantic relations, the era of free riders is, belatedly, I admit, but coming to an end. At the NATO summit that has just concluded, 23 out of 32 NATO countries now meet the alliance's defense spending target of 2%. Poland tops the list with a defense budget exceeding 4% of its GDP, which is actually the highest in NATO, including the United States. And next year, we are going higher. Ladies and gentlemen, while Russia, with the help of other autocracies, is writing another tragic page of European history, the US and the EU must rediscover the value of the transatlantic alliance. Assisting Ukraine today prevents the war that may be at our doorstep tomorrow. Helping them now will be much cheaper than sending personnel and equipment to the battlefield later, should Putin decide to carry out an attack on a NATO member state. And they do talk about it. In the beginning is always the word. First, they threatened Georgia, they did it. They threatened Ukraine, they did it. Today, they threaten Latvia and Poland. And we can afford this, our assistance to Ukraine. The nominal GDP of NATO countries constitutes well over 45% of global GDP and surpasses that of Russia by 20 times. The $300 billion we have pledged to Ukraine since 2022 amounts to 0.65% of NATO countries' annual gross domestic product. It's a bargain. Taming a belligerent nuclear power for less than 1% of GDP is a good deal for money. Europe has also finally moved on its trade relations with Russia, with serious consequences for the Russian economy. Between the first quarter of 2021 and the first quarter of 2024, the value of EU imports from Russia fell by 85%. The share of petroleum oil imports dropped from 30% in the first quarter of 2022 to 3% now. In the first quarter of 2024, the volume of natural gas imported from Russia was 63% lower than in the first quarter of 2021. Last year, for the first time in more than 2 decades, Russian gas giant Gazprom plunged into a net loss of $6.9 billion. Think about it. Gazprom as a loss-making enterprise. From where else can Putin fund this war in the medium term? In fact, Putin's very business model is failing. We should not be fooled by GDP estimates suggesting Russian economy might grow over 3% this year. GDP measures activity, not economic sustainability. A tank financed with state reserves and swiftly destroyed on the battlefield increases GDP, but destroys wealth and the capacity of the economy. The unraveling of the Russian economy is not yet spectacular, but it is real. The reserves of Russia's National Wealth Fund have already halved since the invasion. In a year or two, Russia may lose everything it saved over the past 20 years from profits made on oil and gas. For now, the enormous amounts of money flowing into the Russian military drive inflationary pressure. Annual inflation rates surpassed 8% in June, even though Russian interest rates are 16%. If they dropped interest rates, their inflation would go through the roof. In 2023, Russia's imports of Western technology dropped by 30 to 40% compared to pre-war levels. This means Putin has to pay exorbitant prices for technologies and goods he buys on the black market or extorts from others. International sanctions and US export controls have practically cut off Russia from Western-made semiconductors. The Russians produced 500 to 600 new tanks and a little more than 1,000 new fighting vehicles every year. Meanwhile, they lose more than 1,000 tanks and close to 2,000 fighting vehicles every year on the battlefield. They are trying to patch up the whole thing by pulling out decades-old Soviet tanks from these open-air warehouses, but they are running out of them. These and some other Mad Max-style vehicles that maybe you've seen on the battlefield do not look like the sight of a confident superpower on the battlefield. The West's strategy is working. All we have to do is stay the course, maintain the sanctions while fixing the still existing loopholes. If we do, in 12 to 24 months, Russia should start reaching the end of the line. Wars end in various ways, not only through unconditional surrenders, as in World War II, but also in a stalemate, or because the aggressor has no more resources to spare, as in World War I. While the Ukrainian economy is also under heavy pressures, Kyiv is being supported by its allies, while Russia is being ruthlessly exploited. Ladies and gentlemen, the West must lead by example, convinced of its moral standing and determined to stand up to evil. Weakness emboldens despots and thugs. Strength and resolve deter and diminish their destructive potential. That was true back in 2005 when I was leaving AEI. It is still true today. No matter what turn the world takes in the next 10 to 20 years, there will still be basic democratic values worth defending, and we will still be more effective by defending them together. Thank you.
Minister, thank you. So I should remind everybody that they can still ask questions by emailing my colleague Catherine Camberg, Catherine with a K, Camberg as in CAMBERG @AEI.org, or using the Twitter hashtag NATO75 with AEI. I have a few questions of my own, and I suppose going to make the sort of misstep of dragging this from the sublime and the high-minded to the grubby and practical. So before the NATO summit started, President Zelensky was in Warsaw, and there was a defense cooperation agreement reached with the Polish government, which was widely interpreted as giving Poland the leeway to use its air defenses to shoot down Russian missiles over Ukrainian territory that might be headed towards Poland. Yesterday, or day before yesterday, the defense minister said in one interview that the actual interpretation of the agreement means that Poland would consult with its allies and would seek the agreement of all NATO allies before proceeding with any such measure, which is hard to imagine given the sort of time frames of missiles flying. So one interpretation that's not exactly charitable would be that, you know, you did this in good faith, and then the Biden administration came down on you like a ton of bricks and you know, wrestled you and made you change your mind. Is that uncharitable interpretation wrong?
At this stage, this is an idea. What our agreement says that we will explore this idea. Just so that you understand our dilemma, we're a frontline state, and Russian missiles breach our airspace. We assume by mistake. Some of the missiles that they launched from around St. Petersburg fly along the Polish border through Belarusian airspace, then make a little turn through Polish airspace, the last one 40 seconds, and then hit targets inside Ukraine, Lviv airport, and places like that. And 40 seconds is not much time to react. But there was another missile, was it last year or the year before, which traversed 2/3 of Poland and fell 10 kilometers from my house, and I live in Western Poland. Thankfully, it didn't hurt anybody, but in another incident, a Russian missile came towards our border and was shot down by the Ukrainians, and the debris killed 2 of our citizens. So we have a problem. And our dilemma is the following. If we shoot them down only when they cross into our airspace, the debris is a threat to our citizens and to our property. And the Ukrainians are saying, please, we will not mind, do it over our airspace, when they are in imminent danger of crossing into Polish territory. To my mind, that's self-defense. But we are exploring the idea.
One topic that was very much in the headlines over the past couple of days is this question of how this war ends and how we can make any future ceasefire peace agreement sustainable. There have been various efforts at negotiating and so on and so forth. But what strikes me as obvious is that in order to deal with Russia as it exists, it's hard to imagine a sustainable peace in Ukraine without something equivalent to Article 5 guarantee to Ukraine going forward. Yet the Biden administration, and I think it's fair to say a big chunk of the Republican Party, would have a very ambivalent relationship towards Ukraine's entering NATO. It's fair to say that Germany, as it currently stands, would probably have very mixed feelings about Ukraine's joining NATO. How can Poland help change the tone of the conversation about Ukraine's future membership? And if it can't, can we imagine a sustainable peace in Ukraine without Ukraine in NATO?
Do you mean now or at the end of the war?
At the end of the war.
Sure. That's basically the idea at the moment. But Ukraine first has to win.
Well, but nobody is quite willing to say that once the war is over, Ukraine will be in NATO, right? I mean, the sort of...
Didn't we say that in the communique?
We did.
Well, I don't think that's the way.
On an irreversible course to join NATO.
It's on an irreversible course, but that's not quite the same as sort of committing to bring them in and giving them the Article 5 guarantee the moment the shooting stops.
Well, the guarantee has to be credible. There is nothing more dangerous in international relations than a non-credible security guarantee. We had that in 1939, and it was not good for us. It makes you braver than you should be. NATO guarantees should be only extended to a situation in which we are willing to go to war on behalf of the country to whom we are giving the guarantee. And this is not just a Biden administration problem. There is no appetite in the alliance to do that now. But there is appetite and every willingness. And we were yesterday at 31+1. So 31 countries were fully committed to long-term assistance to Ukraine in winning this.
Now, if we can go back to NATO for a moment. So there are many AI scholars, some of you cited, who I think are keenly invested in making sure that NATO remains relevant and remains a sort of force for the good throughout the 21st century. And I want to bring people's attention to a long essay by my colleague Mark Thiessen, who's in the back of the room, who is putting a few proposals on the table that he hopes would sort of resonate with the sort of President Trump adjacent crowd and people who are seeking to make America great again. And one of his arguments is, one of his proposals is to seek to globalize NATO, to make sure that European allies are more invested in America's global challenges, that we also perhaps bring in countries from the traditional European theater of NATO, such as Australia and Japan, and that we really start building a sort of community of like-minded democracies that goes beyond the traditional sort of Atlanticist understanding of the alliance. And the second proposal that he makes, which I'm sure is going to resonate in right-of-center circles, is that the commitment to spend 2 or better 3% of GDP should be enshrined in treaties, and that Article 5 guarantee should effectively be conditional on allies, paying their fair share, as President Trump likes to say. Are these good ideas, bad ideas, somewhere in between? And how would you sell the idea of NATO to a potential Republican administration?
NATO's basic job is to defend the territory of its members. We have gone out of area on behalf of the United States to Afghanistan, for better and for worse. I think the Far East, militarily, is beyond our capabilities. But we can be helpful, and we are helpful in other domains. We have, for example, the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, consciously modeled on the old Comecon, except more ambitious. We now monitor not only trade, but also cross-investments and technology transfers. There is the regulatory sphere, where we are working together to protect our 5G and beyond from foreign interference. There are joint counter-disinformation efforts, and so on. But we don't have the ships to go to the Pacific. Even the British bought 2 aircraft carriers that are non-nuclear powered. And as regards linking security guarantees to spending, I can see the superficial attractiveness of it, because basically President Trump was right when he harangued allies that they should spend more. And I even supported his style, because when it was done by previous presidents with traditional American politeness, it didn't work. So credit where credit is due. Partly, in the end, it was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but partly also the pressure from President Trump made people wake up. But it doesn't quite work like that. But perhaps there are experts here who will correct me, but last time I checked, Iceland, which is a NATO member, has a military budget of $100,000, which is the bill for the electricity to power a crucial lighthouse on its coast. But at the same time, it has a really important airfield, which could be crucial in providing refueling for missions that you can imagine. So some allies, give them money. Some others have other capabilities. And a military alliance is not a neighborhood security company that, if you stop paying your monthly bill, they stop protecting you. Because there are other circumstances and other assets at play.
So since the new Polish government came into office, I think it's fair to say that you've invested heavily into repairing Poland's relationships with Germany and France. And I suspect that part of the rationale for doing that is to kind of prepare for a possible world in which Europe might have to take care of its security on its own. Now, we saw the legislative election in France that yielded no governing majority. We see what strikes some people as a little bit of fecklessness coming out of Berlin and sort of sluggishness in delivering on the promises of the Zeitenwende. How optimistic are you about the prospect of Europe actually building a properly functioning, coherent pillar within NATO and being able to throw its geopolitical weight around with a little bit more force than it currently is able to?
Europe has no desire to throw its geopolitical weight around, but it should support the US in global leadership. And we should not be calling on the United States during every emergency on our doorstep. You have a problem on your southern borders, so do we. When Libya exploded, we found we couldn't do it without, never mind the wisdom of that operation. But we should be capable of acting in our immediate neighborhood without bothering the United States. Some warlord in the Balkans or the wonderfully renamed Wagner group, which is now called Africa Corps. And Africa Corps is trying to take Tobruk again. We should be able to sort them out on our own. Even if America is engaged otherwise in the Pacific. We should not be so pathetic as we were in the Balkans during the Clinton administration. So with that in mind, Europe is building up a sort of heavy brigade, with enablers, which is supposed to come operational in a couple of years' time. We now have a European defense budget, wonderfully called the European Peace Facility. It's only 7 billion. It was supposed to be 12 billion. If it hadn't been for the pandemic, it would have been more. We need to increase it. We are now doing something that was unimaginable 3 years ago. We are all of it spending on arms for Ukraine. We will have a joint headquarters. We will have. We already have an operations center, and we'll probably have in the new commission a commissioner for defense who will actually be a commissioner for the defense industry, which we need to upgrade. So glacially, but it's happening. And I'm glad to say that the Pentagon now sees the wisdom of it because they want the flexibility to be able to move US forces to other emergencies. And when that happens, Europe should not be completely helpless.
Can we talk about Poland's relationship with China for a bit? So President Duda went to Beijing, was last week or a week before that. And I think Poland has unlike, say, Lithuania or the Czech Republic, been quite cautious in managing its relationship with China, trying to keep the lines of communication open, and so on and so forth. At the time when China is becoming the central preoccupation of US policymakers going forward on both the Republican and Democratic sides. So how do you, you know, are you worried that there might come a point where you have to sort of pick a side and sort of take a more sort of muscular approach towards China, or not? Are you sort of what are sort of Polish priorities in this relationship going forward, other than Ukraine and trying to, I guess, like get some leverage over Russia through Beijing?
There is only one country between Poland and China. We have a neighbor in common, and that determines everything. We respect China as a country that has a different political system, but that has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, which is a very different national experience from ours. For us, communism was a cul-de-sac in our development. China got modernized under the rule of the Communist Party, and it's different. China has never done anything bad to Poland, nor did Poland take part in European colonialism against China. In that sense, we have a common experience. We were both victims of European colonialism in the 19th century. But we recognize that China is a competitor to our greatest ally, which makes this interesting. China intervened in 1956 when Russian tanks were already on the way to Warsaw. And that's why Poland didn't share the fate of Hungary in 1956. And maybe not all of you know that Nixon in China was actually prepared in Warsaw. In the Royal Park in Warsaw, there's a small plaque on one of the buildings where over 100 secret meetings took place between the United States and China to prepare the geopolitical shift. So we will work to moderate the Sino-American competition to our limited abilities to prevent from it going hot. I was the co-author of a European Parliament policy on China of the entire EU, which we believe coined the phrase, collaborate where possible, compete where needed, confront where necessary. The consequences of a kinetic clash between China and the United States would be economically disastrous for Europe and for Poland. So we will work to prevent that from happening.
So before I bring in the audience, one last question from me, which would be a sort of domestic question. And I should preface that by saying that I yield to no one in my criticisms of the previous Law and Justice government and its efforts at incumbent entrenchment. I've written a ton on the changes to the judiciary. I've testified to the Helsinki Commission and so on and so forth. And I'm glad that that process has been stopped and there was a transfer of power and that Polish democracy is alive and kicking. Some people would say, though, that some of the changes that the new government has done in response to the previous entrenchment in public broadcasting, in public service, and so on and so forth, are a mirror image of what Law and Justice did. That the December wholesale changes to Polish TV are basically an equivalent going in the other direction of what Law and Justice did. That the current retirement of 50 ambassadors from around the world is basically taken straight from the playbook of the Law and Justice Party. What would you say to those voices, and why are they wrong?
Well, the Constitution should not be a suicide pact. If an authoritarian-leaning party changes the law to be toxic and takes over for party political purposes, state TV and radio, and turns it into Goebbelsian propaganda, and still has the presidency to veto all legislation, if you tolerate that to continue, you are sure to be defeated. And we believe that all the changes that were made were completely legal, because state TV has a dual existence. It is at the same time public TV and radio, but also they are in fact limited companies. So there are two ways of approaching them, either through legal changes, and those would have been vetoed by a president sympathetic to the previous regime, or on the basis of the commercial code. And changes were made on the basis of the commercial code, because these are companies whose owner is the culture minister. And the culture minister changed the leadership of those companies on the basis of powers that an owner has, and courts have approved those changes. So actually, I disagree with you. I think it's perfectly legal. On the ambassadors, that's my doing. Yes, it's true, I'm changing many ambassadors. First of all, because I inherited a ministry in which 20% of foreign postings were vacant. And among those that were filled by the previous government, well over 50% were party political, rather than professional diplomats. So you know that in the United States, some ambassadors are party political, but in your system, it's between 20 and 30%. In Poland, it also happened before, and it makes sense. In some places, you want a general. In another place, you want an academic. Sometimes you want to send a former deputy prime minister or a minister. There is a role for such people. But in the past, it was always between 10 and 15% of the lot. The great majority of ambassadors were always professional diplomats. I inherited a ministry in which over 50% were party political. And they also passed a law saying that an ambassador is a representative of the government rather than the state as a whole. And there are places where I have to have ambassadors whom I trust. For example, our ambassador at the European Union. Every country's embassy at the European Union is actually a department of the Cabinet Office, dealing with internal politics of the EU. The government has to have an ambassador it trusts. And there are a few other capitals, including this one. So yes, changes are being made, and I don't think that's anything particularly unusual.
Fair enough. We have a bunch of questions from the audience. So we have a question from Levente Takács on asking for your opinion of the Hungarian Prime Minister's Viktor Orbán's so-called peace mission in recent days and the effect it's going to have on NATO and on the Polish-Hungarian relationship.
I read Viktor Orbán's letter to the European Council after his trip to Moscow, and there are a couple of problems with it. First of all, Hungary is the presidency of the European Union right now, but the rotating national presidency since the passing of the Lisbon Treaty has no role whatsoever in international relations. Under the Lisbon Treaty, we've created two new posts. President of the Council, who represents member states in international Affairs, and the High Representative, who coordinates the foreign ministers. The National Presidency chairs meetings of other councils, internal, financial, and so on, but not those. So Viktor went to Moscow as Hungary, not as the EU, but he sent the letter to the capitals on presidency letterhead. And what he informed us of is that Russian and Ukrainian red lines are very far apart, really. Yes, they are. Where I'm troubled is that Hungary seems to be positioning itself in between Moscow and the EU, and Moscow and NATO. And that's not what a loyal ally does.
It is not. A question from an AI alumnus, Lance Kokonos. The money appropriated by Congress is sufficient to provide Ukraine with advanced weapons for at least the rest of this year. Yet the Biden administration continues to prevent Ukraine from striking legitimate military targets deep within Russia using US-made weapons such as ATACMS. What's your message to the White House about how this restriction on Ukraine's ability to fight back and make full use of the weapons provided by the US? You know, how should sort of the US deal with it? Like, are we shooting ourselves in our foot by?
Well, I'm counting on you to make these representations to the American government. But look, just a couple of days ago, the Russians hit a children's hospital, which, by the way, is a war crime, another one. Would it really be escalatory to take down the strategic bombers that launched these missiles, or to hit the airport from which they fly? We passed a resolution in the General Assembly of the United Nations back in February 2022, condemning the Russian invasion as an act of aggression. That's not a press statement. That's legal basis. And not just for helping the victim. It's actually an obligation to take countermeasures to restore international order. And a victim of aggression has the right to defend herself by all means. And so I hope more countries lift these restrictions.
What's your take on Belarus's deepening incorporation within Russian defense and foreign policy?
Well, I've been hearing this deepening cooperation for the last 25 years. And Lukashenko is still in charge. Belarus, true, is also an aggressor country because it's an act of aggression to enable your territory for an invasion. And Belarus did do that, which is why we are equalizing sanctions between Russia and Belarus. He did not join the war directly. Let's count small blessings.
President Duda has proposed, I think, on multiple occasions, raising the spending target for the alliance from 2% to 3%. Couple of questions related to that. So is that Poland's government's initiative, or is this President Duda's freelancing, so to speak? And B, how was this proposal received, and how realistic do you think it is for allies to step up even further, given how difficult it was to drag them kicking and screaming into spending 2%?
I think sequencing is important. Now that we have most allies at 2%, we can ask for more. But we didn't want, first you take stock of what you have, and it was important from the summit for news to spread that at last we are doing the minimum. But you're right, that 2% was a good minimum in peacetime. But we now have a crisis time. And 3 to 4% was the norm during the Cold War. And when Putin is spending 7 or 8 and threatening countries, we should draw the right conclusions. So A, I hope more allies spend more, and B, I hope the burden is spread more fairly, because Poland is still catching up economically with Western Europe. It wouldn't be fair for us to be protecting the eastern flank, defending countries that are richer than ourselves to the west of us. We are already Western Europe's anti-tank mine, right? But defense resources should be spent where the threat is.
Hugo Rosemont would like to know your opinion of the defense industry pledge reached at the NATO summit, and what support the alliance needs from companies as the most urgent priority.
We don't seem to be producing enough 155mm shells, which is a fairly simple thing to do. We didn't just spend the peace dividend, we deindustrialized in the defense area, and we actually slept through the first year of this war, because some people thought it would just go away. It hasn't. We need to rebuild our industrial base to outproduce Russia, but as regards particular capabilities, you need to talk to people who know more about it.
Question from Patrick Misiewicz. So I asked earlier about China. The Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, went to Moscow and they hugged with Putin just hours after the attack on the Children's Hospital in Kiev. What has gone wrong with the West's relationship with India? Can we bring it back into the fold, make it a sort of more committed stakeholder on subjects that really matter to us? Can Poland play a role there? What's the Polish-Indian relationship?
I think India is reclaiming its traditional role of the leader of the non-aligned movement. They can't do a sudden breach with Russia because they have thousands upon thousands of items of Soviet and Russian equipment which need spare parts and servicing. But I believe they've been helpful in reading Putin the Riot Act on using nuclear weapons. And taking Russian oil and paying with rupees only is also quite satisfactory.
How long do you think Russia can restore its military potential to pre-war levels, given the current sort of damages inflicted on the Russians by Ukraine's defenses?
Well, as I've said already, they seem to be scraping the bottom of the barrel as regards these hulks of Soviet-era tanks that they held in storage from the old times. So they are refurbishing older and older models, and they are running out of those. Look, the German defense minister said that NATO should be ready for a major confrontation in 5 years' time. But Germany is not a frontline state. We cannot exclude something even earlier than that.
Asked about the UK. We haven't asked about the UK. So are you looking forward to working with the new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy? Do you think there'll be any changes in the sort of British outlook on Europe? I mean, this sort of announced rapprochement, do you think will be translated into something sort of more material in terms of British support to particularly the eastern flank?
I'm already working with Secretary Lammy. On the second day in office, he went to Berlin, and on the third day in office, he came to my house in Poland. And we are already discussing a security compact with the European Union, which I think would be good to make the relationship close and predictable and institutionalized. And he assures me, and he did even when he was in opposition, that on Ukraine it will be more of the same. And Britain is an important leader of bolstering Ukraine, a position that was confirmed yesterday by Prime Minister Starmer at the summit.
Mr. I'm afraid we'll have to wrap up now. Thank you so much for your remarks. Thank you for being so willing to chat frankly and openly.